Welcome, everyone, to the Gold Silver Bitcoin show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. Thank you so much for joining us. We are more than honored to be sitting down with Dave Collum. Dave he has a PhD in organic chemistry. He is a very viral Twitter account who's commenting on the daily happenings. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. It's going to be a busy week, and you're the leadoff batter. So
excellent. So we'll try to move quick then. Now, as a professor of organic chemistry and a fan of the Austrian business cycle, can you say without a doubt that there are some parallels between organic chemistry and Austrian economics?
I can say that there's, I don't know, parallels, but there certainly are synergies. And I guess one of the big parallels is I studied a very complex field. I started out doing what was called synthetic organic chemistry, which is how do you make drugs, for example? How would you synthesize drugs that shall not be named? And then I moved over to studying how things happen, how things work, and I emphasized organolithium chemistry, which some will say, well, there's an obscure backwater. Well, it turns out lithium is the most prominent metal in organic chemistry, demonstrably the most prominent metal, and it's a very complex world. And so, when I went into it, people said I was going to be a career-destroying move. They suggested that it would never work and that I couldn't figure it out, and none of which was true. It turned out pharma had a great interest in it, and 41 years later, I'm still on my feet, still swinging at the ball. So that worked out well. Now, what I get out of it? Well, it is complex, and it turned out that many people had inferred conclusions without actually doing the hard experiments to demonstrate them. And over the 41 years, I don't think I've ever published a paper where there wasn't something that kind of put a bat to some maxim, some nostrum, some chestnut, as the Brits like to say, that everyone had held dear and turned out to be just a crock. And so what that did is, as I started to look at markets and politics and stuff, I realized that if experts who were very much trying to get it correct can blow it so badly, then experts in any field can blow it badly. And so if I have a superpower, it's the ability to look at a pile of experts, even potentially in a field that I'm not that well versed, and formulate the opinion that they're all full of crap. And so there really are not many people who can do that. There's this natural deferral to the experts. Follow the science. How much did we hear that this year? Follow the science. I don't follow the science. I question it. I question everything. At this point, I am to the point where one of my colleagues said, he said, you take the other side of every issue at this point. I said, yeah, that's right.
What is the scientific method?
Oh, it's much more complicated, much messier than people think. You get taught in science class that you form a hypothesis, and then you set up an experiment and you show whether the hypothesis holds up to scrutiny. And there's a lot more exploring. There's a lot more. I did a poll recently, a survey for a Stanford psychologist who wanted wanted to know about proper methods in chemistry. And his questions were too narrow, too specific about how you handle data. And it's to study a complex problem, you need to explore a lot. You're going to do a ton of experiments that'll never make it into print. And what ultimately dictates whether or not whether it works well, in my opinion, is two things. One is, do you have a deep-seated desire to get it right? Or is your deep-seated desire to publish another paper and move on? And then the second thing is, are you morally sound? I think that people who are morally fragile will tend to cut corners and tell the story they want to tell instead of the story that they're forced to tell. So that's the deal.
I hear stories about how even by observing an experiment, the observer could have an effect on the results. Have you heard the same things? What role does that sort of, do those sorts of angles come in to play a role? And then also, I guess more to the point, how does morality play a role furthermore?
Well, the famous experiment you're talking about is trying to observe an electron, and by virtue of observing it, you perturb it. And the Heisenberg uncertainty principle kicks in. What's also true, there's all sorts of maxims out there. If you're not going to see what you're not looking for at some level, now we always said stuff we're not looking for, but since we're looking for the truth, we might see that. And it's real easy to get stuck in a model that's not working well and just start hanging bells and whistles off it to make it fit. And at some point, it starts looking like a Rube Goldberg contraption. And when it gets to that level of complexity where you have all these adjustments and attachments and fudge factors, it's time to dump it. When your model's a good one, when it's working, the data will make sense. And I actually wrote this yesterday on another topic. It'll be like finishing a jigsaw puzzle or a game of solitaire where the pieces and the cards just start going up very seamlessly, and all of a sudden you go, the whole thing, it fits together. If your model's not right, you'll be constantly forcing data to fit, and it just won't work, and you'll get it wrong. So I think that's what a lot of people in economics and finance do. They come at it with a predetermined model, and they don't notice that it's failing them. And geopolitics too, by the way. I love geopolitics because when something doesn't make sense, it means your model's wrong, period. So we could talk about, Afghanistan. You go, that didn't make sense, right? A 2-year-old could have understood Afghanistan was, you go, well, therefore your model's wrong. I guarantee you it makes sense. It's just not what you think it is.
Fascinating. How does one stay objective on a day-to-day timeline?
I don't know. I'm getting less objective with time. In this partisan world we live in, objectivity is getting to be a precious commodity. You, by definition now, if you take a position on almost any issue, you are necessarily defining yourself as partisan. And so it's very hard to stay objective. In topics that we're not supposed to talk about, scientists are being cast aside because they're taking the opposite opinion, and they're just being objective. But we've entered what I call the age of narrative, where the media, with the media's help and huge money and a huge bias, we are being sold narratives that are sometimes demonstrably ludicrous. But the narrative just keeps getting sold over and over. And then I'll run into someone who believes it, and I'll go, how did you possibly buy that, right? But then I have to ask myself, was it possible you bought a narrative, right? How do you know whose narrative is wrong? And in some sense, we all have our narratives. We all have our worldviews. We all have different Twitter feeds. We all have different news sources. How do we know that our narrative is right or wrong? There's no answer key. At the end, you just say, mine is like finishing a game of solitaire. It fits together. But, right now we're watching the Russia collusion story fall apart. How many people were totally convinced the Russia collusion story, the Trump version of the Russia collusion story, was totally legit, right? How could that not be legit? And now we're starting to find out that it was, now we're starting to go with the Clintons and the Democrat machine. How do we know that's right? I don't know. I just do my best. It's getting painful.
In college, my advisor and professor, Dr. Scott Smith, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, told me that you couldn't really understand what was going, or that rather historians wouldn't look at events until 20 years after they transpired. So perhaps looking back at past events, and I found this at least a little bit more, a little less emotionally charged than thinking about the present day, can offer a little bit of clarity about at least the recent past. So 20 years ago would bring us back to 2000, and there's events we could re-examine. Y2K comes to mind. Iraq.
Y2K also is a great, well, the beauty of Y2K is we got the answer key. The subplot of something like Y2K, which I will admit to having gone down that rabbit hole. The reason is because there were very smart people who were questioning the integrity of the system. They seemed to be doing it sincerely. The feds took it very seriously, and in a risk mitigation strategy, to me, the tail risk was enormous. So if the Y2K story was correct, the supply chain problems we're facing now would have been unbelievable. They would have been unbelievable. So I just said, okay, I'm mitigating risk. And I was advised by someone during that phase. They said, be careful. Don't do anything that requires a catastrophe for you to be okay. So you don't fill your basement with MREs and empty your bank account, right? You throw some bags of rice down there, right? There's sort of moderation, and so I moderate my risk mitigation, and I'm well aware that there are risks that could be so bad that I've fallen short. But I'm kind of a fatalist at this point. For example, if I've made a bad call on the recent dump, then I might die, right? I'm aware of that. I think the probability is very low, but you can't mitigate all risks. And so you just have to do the ones for which, the Wall Street guys will tell you this, if you can hedge cheaply, do it, hedge cheaply.
If you're speaking to a high schooler who is just taking their first, or let's say junior high schooler who's taking their first science courses, what would you tell them science is all about?
A high school kid, I'd be very careful, because I often have students come in my office who are looking for something. And the two topics of late have been, one is that they can't talk to their friends because they will be ostracized for their opinions, which is just a horrific situation we've gotten ourselves in. I don't know how this is possible. When I was a kid, when I went to college, there was no filter. You didn't get ostracized for saying the most outlandish garbage, right? Who cared? Now you get ostracized. I get kids who say, I can't even talk to my friends. I can't let them know I voted for so-and-so, right? It's just not possible. So I worry about the kids coming to my office who have seen the dark side, right? So kids will come to my office who are familiar with zero hedge, who are familiar with some of the alternative theories that are worthy of being investigated, that should be investigated, and that if there's negative consequences should be dealt with. But I don't want an 18-year-old to be doing that. It reminds me when I run into an 18-year-old who's a super right-winger. I go, being a right-winger at 18 is not quite idealistic enough for my taste. You got plenty of time to go to the right, hike up your pants, and bitch about the government. But at 18, you're supposed to be a little utopian, if you're trying to set out to change the world, how do you do it if you think it's hopelessly flawed? Right. So I tell them to stay away from those debates. Don't go there. Don't get into it. Let the old guys fight about it. Go learn how to make robots. Go learn how to, save the whales. Do whatever you want to do that will make the world a better place in a very affirmative way. So I would not go dark on a kid in science, a high school science kid. What I would tell them is, when you get to college is what you make of it. And we're seeing I think what could be a catastrophic sort of loss and function of students. I think there's a lot of kids who are just phoning it in now. And I'm at Cornell and I see it. Our kids are generally pretty damn smart. And I would say the chem majors are really smart, because if you're not, you don't become a chem major. But you get what you put in, and I'm pretty sure, and I don't think this is just old man stuff. I'm pretty sure that the work ethic is attenuated dramatically. And if you want, yes, why? Well, they're on their phones all day. If you gave me a phone and a laptop, would I have been as functional in the library is when I couldn't just pop open the laptop and read, tweets and whatever else? When I was in the library, there's nothing but studying to be done, right? I could fall asleep, but otherwise there's, so I don't think I could do today what I did in grad school. I don't think I would be, I don't think I could do it. I think that the distractions, I got my PhD in 2.5 years. Going from a genetics major to an organic chemist. quite an abrupt transition in 2.5 years. I did it through just brute force, absolutely, and luck, and sort of 1980s beat the Russians in hockey luck. But I don't think I could have had the grit that I somehow brought to bear on the problem back in 1977 to 80.
Because of a cell phone at your side or a smartphone.
Yeah, the distraction. So, I always heard, oh, the kids have it really tough these days. I used to say, oh, that's bullshit. But the digital world is, I don't know if they have it tough, because the whole, life is kind of graded on a curve. But I think there is a chronic underachievement going on. And again, I'm not blaming the kids. I think they've been born into a world where the white noise is just deafening.
Austrian economics and science. Is science applied to something like Austrian economics in a different way than it is to organic chemistry?
I don't think Austrian economics is very scientific. I think regular economics tries to be scientific and fails. I think they reduce everything to a mathematical equation or two, and I don't think it works. Samuelson gets credit for that. I one time asked one of my economics colleagues, when do you study history of markets? When do you study history of economics? When do you study the legends of the past? And she said, well, I had a course in the history of economics. And I'm going, you had a course? Really? That's it? You had a course? So I don't think modern economists are necessarily up to speed on what the Austrian economics world thinks about. So the Austrians think, there's going to be ones who don't like this, but I think I think theirs is more of an Adam Smith deductive reasoning approach to economics. It's more anecdotal. I think it's more looking at history and saying, okay, every time we get a credit bubble, what happens, right? Therefore, you can't print your way to prosperity. It's never worked. And there's an area of Austrian economics that looks more economic, and I can't profess to have read much of that. What I have done is signed off on what's called the Austrian business cycle model that says if you create a credit-based bubble, economic bubble, equity bubble, whatever kind of bubble, credit-based bubbles ultimately give way to credit-based busts. And that's the essence of the Austrian business cycle, is that booms and busts are driven by credit. And it seems irrefutable to me at this point, except for there appears to be a dozen clowns at the Fed who don't understand that, or I always give them the benefit of the doubts, at least in theory, or they're so terrified of what has been done to date that they don't know what to do. So their actions are consistent with clueless idiots or terrified central bankers.
For those who are like Austrian, so there's guys in Austria drinking coffee, what's going on that front, and then like a whole theory of the business cycle to even credit. Can you break down what the Austrian business cycle is and how credit plays a role in the boom and bust cycle?
How can I do this easily and correctly? I think in some sense I've done that. I think the Austrians were exceedingly dismissive of inflationary booms as destructive. When you have an inflationary boom, when you're going into debt, there's a bill coming due in the future. So a great example that I once wrote about was, I said, let's say you wanted to make Ithaca a economically booming zone. So what would you do? Well, you could come in and you could give everybody in Ithaca $50,000 of credit, right on the spot. Now, we created no additional wealth. We did nothing to earn it, but we got 50,000 credit. At some point, we got to pay off the 50,000. What would you notice? Well, you'd notice new cars. You'd notice additions on people's houses. You'd notice the movie theaters were packing up pretty good. Things would be moving off the shelves pretty well. But what you also know is that at some point, 10 years from now, when they say, okay, now you got to pay it back, the thing would completely unwind. And then what you discover is that those three big box hardware stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, and 84 Lumber. We have those in Ithaca, are unsupportable because the demand wasn't organic demand. It was demand pulled forward from the future. So now all of a sudden, what were thinly profitable companies, because there were just so many of them created to capture this boom, are now not profitable. And so now you start getting the bust. And the bust is not just an easy come, easy go, because now you've got these big monstrous facilities that are empty. We've got a mall that's empty. It's not quite empty, but it sure is close to empty. And what do you do with a facility? And it tends to rot into the foundations. And so it's squandered money. It is not efficient to build things that are going to go ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If you do depreciate something over time that created wealth, then that's a different story. If by virtue of that 50,000, you built a company that provided some service or some good that represented a real wealth gain for the city, then that might be sustainable if it wasn't created in excess. And now the place is enriched by virtue of the fact that you now have a new flooring company which can put in floors. Now you're going to go through a bust, but you might survive it, and you have created wealth, you've created housing, stuff like that. But again, the Austrians really emphasize the idea of pulling credit forward, putting debt in the future. There's always a payback period.
Do you have any further comments on the misapplication of science by, I suppose you mean the Keynesian school of economics, perhaps even the modern monetarist school of economics, which seems to be a new burgeoning offshoot of Keynesianism?
Well, Keynes refuted his own theories later in life. There's some famous treatises and quotes where he said, I've thought about this further and I wasn't quite right. So people who like to tap into Keynes's thinking like to go back to his earlier days that had to do with how to get out of the Depression. Now, the Depression, I should add, is revisionist history, in that the bankers and central bankers of the world have created this narrative that says the Great Depression was about failures of central banks to act aggressively. And I could imagine some things they could have done to mitigate some of the damage, but the fact is, and it's really undeniable, the Depression was a direct consequence of a credit-based boom in the 20s. And it was a huge credit-based boom, a consumer credit-based boom, and a margin credit-based boom. And if you actually look at the data, the 30s is just a correction of the 20s excess. So that was a perfect boom bust cycle. And there's a book called Banking in the Business Cycle by Macmillan. I can't remember the others. Banking in the Business Cycle, written in 1937, which is by far my favorite treatise on what the hell happened. And so I lost my train of thought there, so I don't know where I was going with that. But
just regarding we were talking about the Depression, and then we started actually. I was curious about Keynesianism and the misapplication of science.
Right. Well, so Keynes was a big fan of government doing things. That was a period in time before, when government was 3% of the system. It could be inefficient, it could be corrupt, it could be anything you want. It didn't matter because it was only 3%, right? It's like a lump in your breast. Now government is a systemic tumor that represents, I've seen numbers 40, 50% of the system. So now the corruption is gargantuan. The influence of the corruption is gargantuan. The influence of government on our civil liberties is gargantuan. The try to start a small business and see how hard it is. You get Woodrow Wilson gets credited for introducing what's called the administrative state, where he thought that government should be administering things, and that's why something like 30% of the population has to have a license to do what they do, right? Which is stupid. Some things I get, other things are really dumb. So that's the Keynesian world where government gets big, and Keynes Keynes doesn't really, at least the amount I've picked up, doesn't really get at the question of how do you shut it down, right? How do you stop? It's okay to say, well, you stop when things get rolling, but we've shown that that's not even possible in the current era, right? The Federal Reserve, for example, which has been fostering the boom for, I would argue they've been fostering the boom for over 30 years now. But the boom really took off in 94. 94 turns out to be a discontinuity in the interventionist world. But they don't know how to back out. So then we usher in modern monetary theory, which has been around since the turn of the century. They were called chartists, I think it was. And their belief, and in some sense, we've already been living by this, where their belief is that you don't really have to tax people. Because the government can just create money and spend what it needs to spend, and as a consequence, the tax is an inflationary tax. Now, that's one of there's a lot of components. The other notion is that the government therefore can step in and do things when times are bad, and stop doing things when times are good. And I can even endorse that idea. So if the government acted as an interested and responsible economic party, when labor and goods are cheap, they should be building bridges. When labor and goods are expensive, they should not be building bridges, right? And that would be a moderating effect on the economy. The problem is you can't separate that from politics. You also can't stop building a bridge because inflation's starting to run. You can't stop building highways because inflation's starting to run, and you can't stop anything like that because there's always an election in the near future. And so the modern monetary theorists, in theory, are correct and even are describing the way the system already runs at some level, but they've taken it to a new art form. And at one point, Stephanie Kelton, the queen bee of modern monetary theory, the modern version, once said, well, I couldn't believe this. She said, well, you won't have to pay for it. The government will. And I'm thinking, someone should take her PhD away from her. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard out of an economist. But she believes that. And I would say the modern monetary theorists have not a clue, not a whiff of a clue how to deal with inflation. They say, well, you stop doing stuff, but as we know, they don't, they won't, they can't. That's like a crack addict, right? Well, you stop doing the crack when it gets out of control. Well, it doesn't work that way. So I would say modern monetary theory, which kicked into gear in earnest, in my opinion. I was just writing about it in October of 2019. They started pumping money into the fiscal system when the repo spikes started appearing. And then of course 2020, oh my God, it went bananas, just pumping money directly into people's pockets and just government taking over the entire productive system, best I can tell. So and I think we're going to go through a period of great darkness because of this.
You are writing currently on inflation, I believe. Is this what you're writing about, or are there other facets of this current inflationary bug that you are covering?
Well, so every year, about a dozen years ago, I was at a chat board run by a market short selling group called the Prudent Bear Fund. And I wrote a few paragraphs at the end of every year describing how my year went and what I saw coming. And, I'd talk about it. I was a gold bug. And so I did really well, it turns out. And then one year it went from 200 clicks, which was coincidentally the body count of the chat board, to something like 7,000 clicks. And I go, what just happened? Well, a guy named a guy who had started his own blog posted it there, and it went out of control. And the next year, I hit my 30th year of investing and decided, I said, I'm going to do a serious job on this. And so I set aside some time. And instead of just banging out a couple of paragraphs in the morning, I tried to do a good job. And then it went pretty bananas and started getting posted around the web, and people started reaching out to me. And I I got emails from legends of finance saying, oh, I read that. That was really pretty good. So, I know it's been read by people ranging from, David Einhorn, who's a regular reader. Thank you, David. Last year, Larry Summers read it. I know it's reaching dark, dusty corners of the world. So it's become an annual event for me to write this thing. And unfortunately, it's grown to the point where it's a rather onerous thing to do. I write about politics and political correctness and all sorts of crazy stuff. And so it's kind of a chronicling of human folly for the year. And some years, the big event is Jeffrey Epstein, and other years it's, who knows what. So whatever suits my fancy. But I've become a little bit of a slave to the task in that I feel some sense of obligation. I wrote it for myself, and I still write it for myself, but I've got all sorts of people saying, this year's going to be great. I don't know. It feels like it sucks right now. And I hit a low where I have a whole bunch of rough drafts of all the different chapters I intend to write. And so I've got this massive volume of pages of poorly written, poorly documented, unsupported by graphics, unfunny, poorly edited prose. And that's when I'm going, why do I do this? And then I edit it into shape and round up the funny stuff. And I go, it's okay. And usually by the end, I go, that's pretty good. And then I do it. Now, you never know how many readers you get, but I seem to get enough positive reinforcement of my narcissistic tendencies to say, oh shit, I guess I got to do it next year too. So I've been doing it for about a dozen years.
Well, I don't know if that's narcissistic. You are the one giving in this instance, it seems, giving your perspectives, giving your research as well. And as somebody who writes quite a bit myself, I can say that writing is a laborious task. It's not, so in business on a day-to-day, I've done business writing and written for clients, et cetera, but I've also held a number of different roles as well. And all of them are difficult, but the most laborious task must be having to write something that then is critiqued by others. So
that doesn't bother me though.
Not the critiques so much, but the critiques before the edits, rather, not the critique, the edits throughout the editorial process that add to the laborious nature of writing. So I'm talking about blogs in a lot of cases. Now, in my opinion, blogs, this is a quantitative exercise for so many of these startups. You need to figure out what your audience is interested in and write quickly, and then publish quickly, and don't labor or edit things to perfection for many reasons. One being perfection doesn't even really exist. But I can just say that in the business context, writing is quite laborious. And on your writing, I'm curious, like, what is exciting you the most and what's jumping out the most right now?
Well, first I'll tell you, since the dawn of time, or since I was a young assistant professor, I quickly discovered that writing was a critical skill that I didn't have well, and that I desperately needed. And so I became a sort of religious zealot. And I read everything I could, and I commandeered editors as best I could. And I long ago gave up any sense of any angst over someone suggesting an edit. So there's people who take offense at edits. I will find the most savage editor I can find. And I pass the thing around chapter by chapter to family and friends, anyone who's willing to do it. I used to have a professional copy editor who's now basically gone off and become a hermit. So no, I adore editors. I think they do it. And I do think I should write it as best I can. And I do still find typos and old year in reviews, but I try to get them really as close to perfect as I can. That's critical. And so I don't accept good enough and move on. I try not to. The other problem I have is it's gotten big. It's people won't read it now, but if I tell you this, but it's about last year's, the text was about 190 pages. Now, you can't write 190 pages in March about the year. You have to write it in November and edit it in December. And so I'm writing a mini Wealth of Nations here in the month of November. And so And that's the onerous part, is that I have to get into a zone.
That is a difficult task. I will say, so there's, I guess I'm speaking on like a business writing front. So if you have an organization that is, say, a marketing department that's producing copy,
Gotta do fast.
the model that's been proven and is proven by people who have been successful is that you need to pump out a quantity of written content. And therefore, when I see somebody who's got 10 million followers on each individual social media account, and they pretend to be making hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and they have like a typo on a landing page on their main website with 2 sentences on it, it makes me think that we need that a writer or any sort of editing team needs to approach the startup writing much differently than in the academic context. Or if I was writing a book or a real long, like, actually anything for the internet, like unless my highest value was documentation and accuracy, although accuracy is always important, but I guess professionalism and I guess academic interests, then certainly everything you said applies. But when it's coming down to growth for like a especially early stage startup or making money, it seems to be the model is that less editing is more successful. But I just wanted to make note of that.
Well, my son had a cubicle job for a while. He's now a professional musician, which really ends up being follow his dream after trying the finance world. And I think he suffered from he's got kind of an OCD, bipolar perfectionist streak in him. And I think he could not do that. And that's just a hunch I have. And so he's a perfectionist in music, and he obsesses over things, and he can play for hours at a time. And so if you look at my scientific career, besides the complexity of things we studied, which I don't think a chemist listening to this who knows me would say, "Oh, Dave's just blowing his horn." I think I get credit. I one time had a couple of referees say, there's no longer anyone left in the world to understand what you're doing. It is complex. And so, but there's the publisher perish model, which is kind of what you're describing, right? You got to punch it out no matter what. I've lived and died by not publishing or perish, so to speak. My total paper count's not big. But each paper is an attempt to be the definitive treatise on whatever topic that is. It doesn't have to be big, meaning definitive as in large, but when I'm done and publish the paper, that's a puzzle piece that's been laid down, and I'm not going back to it. No one has to go back to it, in my opinion. And as a consequence, interestingly enough, even though I publish a relatively small number of papers, at least compared to the typical peer, I never get criticized for a lack of volume, because the storyline is always intense. The storyline, in a grant proposal, for example, I say we looked at this and this and this, and this is what we found, and this is why it's really bizarre. And when people read it, they get to the end. I think if you've written a good proposal, the person gets to the end and says, "Wow." And if at the end they get to the end, they say, "I have to read it again," then you blew it. So I want the reader of my grant proposal to get in and just stand back and go, "Wow." And from that point on, their goal is to just justify why they said wow and give me a good score. And as a consequence, I had an unbelievable record of funding in a field that, again, I was assured would never be fundable, because I was able to get them to say wow at the end of each grant.
So as you're writing this yearly summary, I guess, what is the definitive treatise on 2021 so far, as insofar as can be spoken?
I think we've been creeping towards something that I think is blown up completely, and we have to be careful here to protect your YouTube channel. But I think what has happened in 2021 is that what the world has been shown, if they're paying attention, is that we're heading towards, and I wouldn't have said this a year ago, we're heading towards a global totalitarian state. I've gone that dark. I see nothing. Everything points to that. we're in the age of narratives where those narratives are, where the media is controlling the flow of information, and that we all kind of knew. Depends which news you watch, but Brian Stelter and Tucker Carlson are not going to tell you the same story. But I think 2021, the brutality of the narratives, the people being thrown in jail for things that should have been misdemeanors, the people who are, I described 2021 as the year, my opening paragraph, I said, see if I can recapture this, the year that that liberals were throwing eggs at black politicians, conservatives were saying, my body, my choice. Republicans are pushing for legalization of pot, and libertarians are saying, please, somebody just shoot me. And that's what this year feels like. And the challenge is that I know your audience is going, boy, this guy's a downer. I'm actually a funny bastard. And I was voted class clown in high school. And I think the document that I write is usually funnier than hell. This is going to be a tough one to be funny, right? This is going to be, but I had Larry Summers say, hey, I laughed my way all the way through it. And so if I can get there, if I can make the points while still bringing humor, still bringing Dave Barry into the story, still channeling Jon Stewart, then I will have succeeded. And I'm right now at the phase, it's like early November, where it's not funny and it's not well written. So everything that I hold dear is missing. I'm just trying to put together the storyline right now. So that'll be the theme. I'm going to conclude where we may be inexorably heading for a totalitarian state. That's my opinion.
And my understanding is that you are more attracted to precious metals than Bitcoin, for instance.
Yeah.
Can you talk about why precious metals are important today?
Well, right now they're not working as well as one would have thought. So right now, the smartest thing you can do is own Tesla, and the dumbest thing you can do is own gold. I believe that that regression to the mean is a force of nature, and there's things that just cease to happen after a while. I believe that Tesla will end up getting auctioned off on the courthouse steps at some point. I believe investors will be hurt very badly by buying into these story stocks. There's a thing called the Lindy effect, which I find a little trite, but it basically says the longer something's been around, the more likely it is to stay around, and so gold wins. I know your hodler team is going, well, yeah, but Bitcoin's better. And I go, well, okay, but you've been around for 10 years. You've got some proving to do. I share the sympathies of the hodlers. They call them hodlers, but it's hodlers. I don't care what they say. You've got battles in front of you, and the outcome of those battles. This is like Fort Sumter, and you guys are firing on some fort, and whether you win may be not going to play out for a number of years. And I do believe that the hodlers are going to end up doing battle with the sovereign states, capital S states. And I believe that they don't want anything to do with Bitcoin. They're right now pretending to tolerate Bitcoin. I believe at some point the battle will be on. And then again, at some level, I'm rooting for the hodlers because I share their views of the world. While at the same time conflicted because I think they're taking a bite out of my gold bet. So, but that's okay. That's okay. You guys can have 2021. I'll take 2022. Whatever. We'll divide up. We'll divide up the world into its components. We can all do well in the end. And to the hodlers, what I'll tell them is, again, I'm a total amateur. There's another reason why I'm not interested in Bitcoin. It would take me many hours to understand it, and they say, "Well, you should do that right now." I don't need anything else on my plate to worry about, and so I'm sitting there going, "Okay, is the blockchain really got the integrity they say. You know, you read all the stories about the guys who get some account with some organization that gets gutted. The guy runs off to Bimini with the money, and you go, well, but you don't have to do it. I go, yeah, but that would be me, right? That's the problem. So I don't want to be sitting there wondering if when Tether goes south, which I believe it will, based on my highly limited reading, but Tether looks unstable to me. What will that do to the Bitcoin? I just don't know. And I'm sure there's hodlers who either know or think they know. And power to you, you've done more work on this than me. So for me, gold's simple. It's just a simple inflation hedge. My house is 3 times the size of the house that I need, not in terms of size, but in terms of value. It hangs off a cliff off Cayuga Lake. The decision to buy it was not because I needed to spend 3 times as much on a house, but it's kind of a bit of a long inflation tying real estate because risk assets look terrible to me. I said, fuck it, I'm going to have a house and I'm going to enjoy the house. And so property taxes are killing me, but that's a separate issue. I did the math on that. I did the risk mitigation on that. So so that's why I'm long gold. I'm getting longer energy, but also I deeply, deeply believe that we're going to have a secular bear market. I have a definition of a correction. Here you go. I use this on podcasts all the time, so, but your readers probably didn't listen to any of my podcasts. A correction has 2 requirements. One is it corrects the price of the asset significantly. And the second is it corrects investors' attitude significantly. And so you say, when was the last correction? And of course, the most simple-minded individual says 2020. I go, explain what attitude got corrected. And by the way, explain what asset price got corrected. They go, okay. 2008, 2009. I go, we're something like 200% off the 07 highs. So that corrected very little. And the investors have learned, don't do anything, even if it's looking bleak. So they keep getting told, just whatever you do, you just hang on for dear life. What I can tell you is that there are times in history in the 20th century where the capital value, inflation adjusted capital value of the S&P treaded water, moved $0 for up to 75 years. The inflation adjusted capital gains treaded water for 75 years. The people who don't understand that are at great risk. And there's a number of those periods. The inflation adjusted capital gains in the 20th century was about 2.1%. It was trivial. And they think they're going to get 17%. They're delusional. I think the valuations are at all-time highs, well above the 00 high, well above the 29 high. I think we're up in Japanese Nikkei land. And right now, the Japanese investor is 30 years older and still down by about 25%. So again, beware. So with all that, that doomsday scenario, I think we're going to face something that will at least look like the 67-81 bear market, where if you inflation adjust over 14 years, you lost 75%. Is the average investor right now ready to wake up 14 years from now down 75%? The answer is no. They don't even think it's possible. They think there was a poll that showed that investors think we're going to get a 5% correction. A what? That's a bad afternoon. Morgan Stanley came out and said that they were predicting a 10 to 15% correction, and then they wrote an article about how much guff they got from all their clients. 10 to 15%? Are you kidding me? That wipes out part of this year. Part of this year. We've been on a roid range since 94. And I will make the case that we've been on a roid range since 94. At some point, that will get unwound.
As a chemist, is there anything that excites you about gold and silver?
No. Well, silver, yeah, at some level. I'm a lithium chemist, so yeah. The silver story, I think, is more interesting than the gold story, but it's very hard to know when you've been duped. So it's I have to read sell side analysts talk about silver, just like the equity guys read equity analysts talk about equities. But the silver story, to the extent that silver is essentially not recyclable. Now you say, the photography guys used to recycle. Yeah, but that's now gone. And they recycled it so well, they weren't even a consumer of silver. But the entire digital world, everything uses silver. It's not cost effective to recycle. And so unlike gold, where it builds up in heaps and mounds and as more of a monetary metal, silver is constantly being depleted. Whatever they dig up, they got to go find more because they can't get it back. And I'm bullish on the not only silver, I'm also bullish on the base metals. I think as we spend $150 trillion trying to save the world from a fictional climate change, I think the base metals will do well. But again, if we've got a secular bear market coming, we're all going to get hurt. We are anyone who owns anything that's got a listing on the New York Stock Exchange will be hurt. And if you buy something dear, something cheap, if you pay dearly, you're toast. Michael Berry, a bunch of his posts from 20 years ago, the posts that got him famous and got him into money management, but someone dug him up. He said his bottom line assessment of an investment is if it goes badly, my bottom line decision is to just hold on to it. Now, if Netflix goes badly and you just hold on to it, what are you going to have? You're going to have Netflix could go down 99% in what you own or shares in a company, which is now much cheaper, but still loses money. Is that really would Michael Berry buy Netflix? And the answer is no, not by that metric. Whereas Rio Tinto, has a 5 or 6% dividend yield. I hate PEs, but has a PE of around 10. Has mines all over the world. So it would take an asteroid to take them out. And so if you bought Rio Tinto and it turned against you, whatever, I'll get the dividend. I'll hang on to it. So I'm looking at energy and stuff like that. Energy is it such an unbelievably down and out state amongst investors. They booted Exxon from the Dow and put it Salesforce.com. What the hell was that? Well, what is Salesforce.com? I don't even know what it is, right? They booted Pfizer, they boot Exxon, they put in Salesforce.com. That's insane. They say, well, it's a cloud play. I go, well, how about Google? At least go with Google. No, they went with Salesforce.com. And then it turns out that the energy used to be 15, 16% of the S&P not too many years ago. It's now 2%. It's just under-owned. It's just no one wants energy. It's not there. No one cares. Maybe it's because they think solar panels are going to save someday. I don't believe it. I think solar panels are potentially an environmental disaster. I think windmills are an environmental disaster. I think these alternative energies are one of the great marketing scams of the modern era. They're razor thin energy profit margins, if they exist at all. I've been told solar's pretty good now, but what are they going to do with all those solar panels? How many are there? 500 million, a billion? I don't know. What are they going to do with all the ones when they're no longer usable? They don't have a clue. So you can invest in that stuff, or you can invest in meat and potatoes. I'm a meat and potato guy. Gold and regular stuff.
We've had the honor of sitting down and speaking with Dave Collum. He's a professor of organic chemistry at Cornell, a libertarian, a fan of the Austrian business cycle. He finds it hard to stay objective in a polarized world, and he's not sure if he's been duped on silver or not. Dave, where can people find your work?
I should clarify that last one, by the way. I've been a silver owner since '99. So even though maybe I've been duped, I'm still way up. They can find my work two places. One is every year I write a thing called a year in review. So if you search my name and year in review, you can find them. Just year in review and David Collum, and there it is. You'll put in a date, you'll get that year's. My only other presence is when I do something that catches Zero Hedge's attention. So I once searched Zero Hedge and found I had 61 hits. So I appear to be what I like to say is a Russian operative now. And besides that, my Twitter feed, David B. Collum, as long as it lasts. But I've been I've been posting a lot of tweets on the V word and the C word, and one of these days they're going to send me packing. I've gotten a few timeouts from Twitter. I called Anthony Fauci a skanky whore. That got me a week off from Twitter. Got a couple others for posting a link that's just the wrong thing, just some Orwellian moment. I said, no, that link's not acceptable to us. So I'll follow Alex Berenson to the light, and then I'll have to figure it out, because Twitter I find to be pretty useful.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening.